Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I think this 1:45 slot is like the 7th inning stretch at a baseball game between lunch and coffee. So I'm going to ask you, just if you're able, just stand up and take a stretch right now. Yeah, Dawn, lead us in the stretching. That's my one of 2 requests. Just, yeah, get yourself sorted. Perfect, perfect, perfect. Thank you so much. Breathe in, breathe out. Let me get set up. Fantastic. Okay, thank you guys so much for humoring me with the 7th inning stretch. There'll be one more ask of you in just a moment, giving you a heads up. My name is Allison Wills from 20 Cents, and I am your moderator for this presentation and discussions on generating timely and meaningful Canadian real-world evidence to support an outcomes-based market access agreement. And we're going to be looking at a case study in RWE and oncology called ASCOT. So by the end of this session, you will know what ASCOT is, and we're going to learn some things about RWE for market access agreements, particularly for outcomes-based agreements. So here's my second ask of you today. I know that we've had lots of discussions in the past at this conference and others about the potential for timely access mechanisms like outcomes-based agreements, and a key component of that is generating evidence, new evidence, so collecting data, generating evidence. I'm just curious if there's anyone like me that still has questions, and you can raise your hand if you do, about the how to collect this data that's meaningful and appropriate and timely for outcomes-based agreements. Okay, well, so those of you who didn't raise your hand, you're going to come up here and talk a little bit about how to do this, okay? But anyways, I think about 3/4 of the room put their hand up, so that's great because we have here today a group of expert panelists who are going to help us discuss and learn about this exact topic. So I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves, panelists, and maybe give us a flavor about why you're here today in just a sentence or two, and then I'll jump back in a moment. So Dr. Cheung, I'll start with you.
So hi everybody, I'm Winson Cheung. I'm a medical oncologist by training based in Calgary. I also run the Oncology Outcomes, or O2 group in Alberta, and I was involved in the ASCOT study that Allison mentioned, and I'll be describing that in a bit more detail shortly.
Thank you. Jessica?
I'm Jessica Arias. I'm a manager with the Provincial Drug Reimbursement Programs at Ontario Health. Been there for 10 years now, and it was Cancer Care Ontario, so I manage our drug funding budget for oncology injectables. I also manage the evidence building program where we've done a couple of studies on products that were conditionally funded until evidence was developed. So I'm here to support Allison in this discussion and contribute based on my experience.
Thank you, Jessica.
Yeah, Graham Statt. I'm a former Provincial Drug Plan ADM, and also for a time was the vice chair of the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, and I'm also here to support the discussion and to contribute based on my experience.
Thank you. Amyn Sayani. I lead the medical evidence generation group at AstraZeneca here in Canada. We do a lot of our evidence generation work, real-world evidence studies across all our therapy areas, oncology and non-oncology, primarily supporting the Canadian business. Happy to be here with this panel. Thank you to Allison for putting together this wonderful panel, and to Kat for letting us be here. Looking forward to the discussion.
Okay. Thank you so much, and welcome to you all. So the format of this session, I'm going to give you a very brief overview of what you need to know about outcomes-based agreements and data before we get into the ASCOT study. So Dr. Cheung is going to give you a presentation of the findings of that study. And then the bulk of this will be a discussion about the different elements of data generation and how to do that data part of an outcomes-based agreement with the panelists. Save your questions for the end. Of course, we'll have lots of time for you guys, so I'm counting on you. That's my third ask of the day. Won't be any more asks. All right, let's just get into it. So a quick background on innovative market access agreements, real-world and evidence generation. What this all comes back to is timely access for patients to therapies that are coming to market here in Canada. We know that outcomes-based agreements have been done in this country. We saw a presentation earlier this year by the pCPA showing the types of agreements that they've had. But what's really important when we're looking at timely access mechanisms And using something like an outcomes-based agreement is that there's a data collection part of it. So outcomes-based agreements is just one tool in that toolbox to use to support timely market access. When we're talking about these agreements, we have the financial component of the agreement. I think we're all familiar with PLAs and rebate-based agreements. It's sort of traditionally been used in this country. But with outcomes-based agreements, what's happening is that access would be given to the patient, the product would be listed, and then additional evidence would be generated, data would be collected, evidence generated from that data, and then that's used to help adjudicate the financial part of the agreement. This is a new skill set that we need to put in place, right? Generating evidence to support a financial agreement. That's what we're going to talk about here today, so that data collection piece. There has been a lot of research in this country on how to generate real-world evidence to support healthcare decision-making. And this first study, I'll just tell you a little bit about it because it's a bit of a precursor to the ASCOT study. Myself and Dr. Cheung and some others were involved at looking at the Alberta Oncology health system data and looking to see if it could be used to support an outcomes-based agreement. And what this is not actually touching the data. It's looking at the data readiness, the data interpretation, and the data time frame. So, is there data that is accessible for an OBA, complete and accurate? Data interpretation, is that health outcome clear and simple? And data time frame, can it be collected in a reasonable time frame? So it's looking just at characteristics of a data set. So what we found, looking at 5 outcomes, I'll just show you really the results of that, is that overall survival and time to next treatment, those 2 health outcomes in Alberta are already there. They're in the health system data, and they are ready, available, timely, and suitable to support an outcomes-based agreement. One other element with OBAs that often comes up is the question around, well, how timely is this data? Can we get it in a quick enough time frame that all parties would be comfortable with running an agreement, perhaps over multiple years, et cetera? So for this exercise, what we did specifically was we looked at, for those 2 metrics that were available, OS and time to next treatment, what would the time frame be to collect the data? So, OBAs can be set up in a lot of different ways, and in this one, we use the hypotheses of recruiting patients over a 12-month period and then monitoring them for a 12-month period, which you'll see up there on the top sort of section of the timeline, and then looking at how long would it take for the data logistics. That's the middle piece for both of those. And then how long would it take to do the analysis and reporting? So in this instance, we saw that it was about 2.5 to 3 years when using OS and time to next treatment to collect the data from start to finish for this type of OBA. What we'll see, though, is subsequent research has come out in recent years showing that actually payers and manufacturers might both want some interim reporting along the way to help them adjudicate their budgets or their sales forecasts, which usually happen on an annual cycle. So that's just a little nugget to keep in mind as we look at what was happening in the ASCOT study. So I want to now bring us into the topic at hand, which is the ASCOT study. This is the Alberta small cell study on clinical outcomes and treatment patterns since the introduction of Durvalumab. What's really interesting here is that the team working behind this study, they took the concept of investigating the real-world data and real-world evidence generation to support an OBA one step further. They actually tested this data collection and reporting process in a real-world setting by measuring cancers with short-term trajectories and looking at the outcomes. So the concept of using Alberta health system data, they went one step further and they actually did a study on it. So that is the ASCOT. I'm going to, before we invite Dr. Cheung up, I'm just going to ask Dr. Sayani if perhaps you could give us a quick overview of, what was the objective of putting together this ASCOT study?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for that setup. I think what was important in the setup that you provided is the work that you and your team had done with the Alberta data, along with Dr. Cheung, on being able to demonstrate the availability and the readiness of this data to be able to take information and data that was there to be able to describe how you might do an outcomes-based agreement. And so what was important is that, you show that our overall survival, time to next treatment were appropriate variables for us to look at. What we did then is to be able to say, do we have an indication, do we have a drug that we might be able to test in this particular scenario and show that we can do this? As you may be aware, 12% of lung cancers are small cell lung cancer, and of which 6 to 7% are extensive stage. Our previous studies that we had done within our own group in Alberta and Manitoba had shown that there were very low rates of first-line treatment and even lower survival rates. I think these were about overall survival in the real world with current therapies had been around 8 months, and only about 8% of patients actually reached survival rates. At only 8% survived at 5 years. Durvalumab was approved in September 2020, and so it was important for us to sort of look at this and say, well, how have treatment patterns evolved since the introduction of Durvalumab? How has the treatment landscape changed, and what are the real-world clinical outcomes? At the same time, as you mentioned, there was a lot of interest in OBAs and a lot of interest in the use of real-world evidence, and whether or not we could actually use RWD for outcomes-based agreements. And so we took this step further to say, this is an appropriate drug, this is an appropriate indication, we should be able to measure these outcomes in a reasonable time frame, and so let's set this up as an actual, people like to use the word demonstration project, pilot project, whatever it might be. We just said, let's see if we can get it done. And so that was the approach we took. This drug serves as a good role model for the reasons that I've already described. We wanted to understand and demonstrate the feasibility of being able to collect real-world data, how we would implement it, how quickly we would be able to get the data, how would we collect the data, what is the frequency with which we could collect it, what data infrastructure was needed. And so we really wanted to test all of these different elements out. We had seen the work Dr. Cheung had done. We were aware of the Alberta Health Service data set as a very valuable data set. There's a lot of good linkage of data between the clinical and the administrative. And so we thought this was a good opportunity for us to actually do this. And so we sought out Dr. Cheung and started working on pulling together a protocol to be able to test this exact concept. So
Okay, fantastic. So I will also seek out Dr. Cheung right now and ask him to come and speak to us about the ASCOT study. Dr. Cheung?
So I think I told some of you that I took the red-eye flight this morning from Vancouver to Toronto, and I think I'm starting to feel the effects of the flight now. It seemed like a good idea a week ago, but maybe not so much now. But despite needing caffeine, I'm very excited to be here, mainly because of this study. We're very proud of it, and I'm happy to share some high-level results and findings from this investigation. So as was already mentioned by Allison and Amyn, really the premise of the study are several-fold. One is to better understand the patient characteristics, treatment patterns, and outcomes of patients with extensive stage small cell lung cancer in the real-world setting since the introduction of this new medication called Durvalumab. And how this study was structured is as follows. We accrued patients over a 1-year time frame since the introduction of the new medication, so specifically July 2021 to July 2022. We then followed these individuals in regular fashion and regular intervals over the span of 2 to 3 years. Just to be clear, it was a retrospective analysis because we were tracking these individuals, but we would kind of go backwards every quarter, every 3 months. So for all intents and purposes, we were tracking these patients, but going backwards to look at their outcomes every so often. Importantly, because this was a pilot or demonstration study, we also developed an OBA steering committee. And the benefit of having this committee was to really get their insights and input in terms of what was going well, what was not going well, what would you improve if we were to redo the study in the future. And we also want their comments and feedback in terms of what they felt were the key data requirements or elements that would be important in an OBA setting. We also want to get their feedback as well in terms of how we can circumvent some of the obstacles and barriers that we did encounter throughout the study process. So as I already discussed, it was a cohort of 1 year, about 60 or so patients. We did a series of quarterly retrospective analyses on these individuals, and after each quarter, we'd also produce a report. The steering committee consisted of not only data experts from our team, but we also involved a number of clinical experts and oncology leaders to ensure that the buy-in was incorporated. So some of these names you may be aware of. So these are largely lung experts given the topic at hand, but also some oncology division heads and directors so that their input can also be integrated. Again, as I discussed, the key questions that were to be addressed by this committee included, were they happy with the data and outcomes that were measured? Were there other things that are missing they want to see? And we also want to reassure ourselves that it was possible to generate these quarterly reports because that was a pretty large undertaking. So again, I'll just give you a snapshot in terms of the key findings. So overall, we were able to demonstrate that the real-world effectiveness of Durvalumab in this small cell lung cancer population did mirror and align with the findings of the clinical trial. More importantly, we were also able to show that OBAs are logistically feasible, at least in Alberta. The outcomes we were able to assess and ascertain are as follows: overall survival and time to next treatment. And these are elements or outcomes that we were able to revisit from Allison and my group's earlier work. We were also able to capture items such as duration of therapy, as well as reasons for discontinuation. Some of these parameters did require a chart audit of the actual patient records to ascertain. Also, as equally important is the fact that we were able to generate these quarterly OBA reports. Each report included a detailed case flow diagram, who were still alive, who were still on drug, what were their demographics and clinical characteristics, what were their outcomes, and again, as I mentioned, what their time to next treatments were, and also if they passed away, their reasons for their death. I also thought it was very successful to have the committee be involved from beginning to end, as we were able to kind of get their feedback throughout the course of the study. And again, I think their insights were very valuable because throughout the study, we were able to add additional endpoints to what we're capturing. I know this is a somewhat busier slide, but this is sort of an overview in terms of how the study reports look like on a quarterly basis. I already mentioned there's a table that describes the lay of the land in terms of what the cohort looks like. And then at each quarter, we'll also look at their outcomes. Again, as I already shared with you earlier, the outcomes in the real world did track quite well with what the trial showed. So I already spent a bit of time in terms of what insights were gained, but I think it behooves me to also underscore to you what were some of the challenges. So even though we were able to capture a number of key endpoints and outcomes, there were additional ones that I think the committee want to see. So a common one that comes up quite a bit is recurrence or progression information. That's always pretty hard to come by in the oncology literature. There was also comments and remarks to really reiterate the fact that more stakeholders at the committee level will be really important. So we were able to include oncologists, clinical experts, and oncology leaders, but having payers and also patients at the table will be equally important. We did try to engage these parties as well, but for this study, we weren't able to recruit these individuals to the committee. Another remark that was very common was this is very Alberta specific, and the question now is, can we expand what we've learned to other jurisdictions and other provinces? As you may have heard from previous speakers this morning, it's very difficult to get national data sets. It's very, very hard to come by, mainly because the data rules are quite strict, and even sharing data across borders, it can be quite tricky. So the question now is, are there existing data sets that we can leverage? So the idea of using patient access program data or patient support program data has come up quite a bit because, as you know, these are national in scope, and perhaps they can be tapped into to address similar questions that we have done in the context of this study. So that was a whirlwind kind of overview in terms of what the study aimed to achieve. So now I'll turn it back to maybe Allison to.
Perfect. Come join us here. Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Cheung. So for that overview of ASCOT, and I think for me, the first time I saw ASCOT, I thought, wow, this is really fantastic because we talk so much in this country about how can we do this implementation of outcomes-based agreements as a barrier. And seeing two big elements for me were the steering committee, putting that in place and testing how that can be used, as well as those quarterly feasibility reports. That's something new I hadn't seen before, so kudos to you guys for putting that in place. Now we're going to go on to our discussion part of this session and really looking to see what we can learn from the ASCOT study in terms of generating meaningful and timely real-world evidence. So I'm going to build on this steering committee question, and I think this is going to be for Jessica and Graham. I'm curious, we heard Dr. Cheung say that for this simulated OBA that they would have liked to have payers involved in the steering committee. I'm just curious from your perspectives and past experiences, who would the appropriate parties be to have included in an OBA steering committee? And even what specific considerations are there for engaging these folks and timing on that? Maybe Jessica, I'll hand it to you first.
Thanks, Allison. So I'll start with the timing. I think as early as possible is probably ideal, even at the health technology assessment phase or prior. I think because forming the plan for an OBA takes some time. I know with the evidence building program, we had 2 products go through. It took tremendous effort on behalf of several individuals who were involved in the planning of it, and it took a lot of time to implement conditional funding, because you really need to think about who are the stakeholders, what are the outcomes of interest, what's the data that we need, who's going to analyze it, and what do we do with the analysis at the end. So you really need representatives from all aspects of stakeholders. I would say for the steering committee, a patient who can validate the outcomes that are meaningful, that were expressed during the HTA review process. So we see, based on the surveys that come through and the patient input, this is what's meaningful to them. So you want to make your OBA relevant to the patient. For a payer, they're the ones that are going to have the ongoing relationship with the manufacturer, so they need to have input early on to say what's even feasible, because it's more likely than not that the payer is going to be responsible for the data analysis and assessing whether the data's there and are there resources to conduct the analysis. We found that having a data expert, a methodologist early on to say, yes, we can do this, no, we cannot, was critical. And obviously the clinical expert who can also ascertain what's meaningful, what are meaningful outcomes.
Okay, thanks, Jessica. I'm curious, Graham, from your experience as well, the ASCOT steering committee included industry partners and the data experts and clinicians. What are your thoughts on this? And also just building off what Jessica said, to include a patient and a payer on a steering committee.
Yeah, I guess my thoughts would be almost having 2 committees, one sort of the scientific committee, and that's where your data scientists and clinicians are, maintain the neutrality there. And then on an overall steering committee, you certainly should include payer, manufacturer, patient representative, maybe someone from the patient organization. You could probably get broader there in terms of representation. I think payer time is probably a factor. It may have been a factor in this case as well, as you couldn't get payer involvement. But in any case, payers are going to want to be involved from the beginning to understand the design of an OBA. And you could still have cross-pollination between the 2 committees if you had, say, the chair of the scientific committee also being present and represented on the governance committee, that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, I think payer would want to be able to ask even the scientific committee questions at any time, and also be wanting to ensure funds are being utilized appropriately, that sort of thing.
Okay, thanks for that. And I'm curious, just going to push you on this. What's your perspective on the industry partner being involved with this, and what is their role?
Yeah, I mentioned on the steering committee side, I think definitely should be present. And I think their role is, obviously a lot of times they're bringing funding for the enterprise, but also know their therapies pretty much better than anybody else. And so I think they're bringing great knowledge base there, answering questions, helping along the way. But I wouldn't include manufacturer presence on what I'm terming the scientific committee.
Okay, fantastic. Any other comments from the group on this question? No?
Yeah,
Oh, go ahead.
I think in the UK, Netherlands. I think the sponsor will actually submit a proposal with their submission for a health technology assessment. And I think that's helpful, just going off of what Graham said. They know their product best. They know what the drawbacks are, what the outcomes are that are meaningful, what data is missing, what evidence is needed. So a proposal at the offset would be helpful.
Okay. I know we had a little pre-call on this, and I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to pick up on this question from Jessica, or this point from Jessica. So I'm curious, thoughts for the panel to comment on. This was a simulated OBA, but if there were to be a real OBA proposed, what would be the best place to have those conversations? You mentioned now a proposal early on. Is there something more specific that you could propose, or maybe that you've seen in the past? And even for any of you, if you have experiences in trying to propose these types of innovative agreements, has there been challenges in when and where to do that appropriately? So maybe back to Jessica. Sorry, Jessica, I'm putting you on the spot.
I think national engagement is important for these. We've definitely had engagement with manufacturers at the local level, and knowing that across Canada we're really trying to align funding decisions and have equitable access across, which is progressing away from the way it may have been in the past. It's hard for one jurisdiction to just deviate and do something related to an OBA. It really has to be a concerted effort, I think, on a national level. And there would be power behind that, especially for smaller provinces, rare diseases, just an ability to combine efforts and resources to conduct such activities.
Okay, fantastic. Graham? Yep.
Yeah, underscore early as possible, and I think Jessica mentioned earlier as well, the idea of even a pre-submission type meeting before or at the point of HTA application. Payers are going to be tracking exciting medicines. A lot of times there's these pipeline conversations that are being had. The exciting medicines and the breakthrough stuff, they're going to make time for that. And so I think an early conversation would certainly be welcome. And I guess I'd just throw idea for future state, maybe an idealist idea for future state, but I think in a perfect world, if we can get to the place where CDA and pCPA are creating kind of a special teams approach, where for special medicines, breakthrough things coming through, often in an expedited way with a lot of political and patient expectation, to right up at the front end have these critical conversations that might involve innovative agreements and OBA-style agreements, and structuring the kind of governance that we need early on in the process to be successful.
And I think it's just kind of building on this. I think this is where the opportunity for us may be, right? I think we have a unique opportunity. So you mentioned earlier that the manufacturer and the industry partners have a really good understanding of their product and what the data says. And that's where there may be opportunities where, when we're looking at these data sets carefully, we know where the uncertainty may be, whether it's clinical or economic. And is that an opportunity for us when we think about we want to bring these medicines to patients faster, and we want to get that timely access? Is there an opportunity? Maybe it's a special committee, right, that kind of sits down and says, hey, the manufacturer can open the door and say, we've got this innovative drug. This is the type of data we have. There is an unmet medical need. Is there an opportunity for us to consider some sort of coverage with evidence development or OBA to be able to collect real-world data and get access to the drug, right? And so that may be a really interesting way for us to get that data faster, but get access to patients faster as well. So there is an opportunity for us to really push for this sort of approach. And I think certainly it's not every drug and it's not every indication, but we've now shown that it's possible, right? And you can get these data, you can get these reports, you can actually look at these reports and show what the clinical outcomes are and be able to make some decisions around those outcomes and continued funding for the drug.
Go ahead, Winson.
I do want to maybe underscore the early engagement piece that's applicable to not only the payers, but also patients and the data experts and clinical experts, because I think this ASCOT study was done in a pretty efficient manner, but despite that, it was still quite resource intensive and took 2-3 years for it to materialize. So the time course of doing an OBA, I think, is that 2-3 years. So when I talk in other venues, I think there's this assumption that it can be turned around in 6 to 12 months, and that's really not the case. And I think in some jurisdictions it can take even longer. So I think early engagement across the board, I think, will be really key.
Okay, thank you all for those comments. I'm wondering if we can pick up on a couple of things here. So the time frames for the data generation, and now really unique in the ASCOT study, we've seen that these quarterly reports were able to be generated. So reports were able to be generated on a quarterly basis. So a question for Dr. Sayani and Dr. Cheung. I'm curious about what was the experience of generating those quarterly reports and even working with that steering committee. So maybe the generation question for Dr. Cheung to start, and then we can talk a little bit about the steering committee experience with the reports.
Sure. So I think when we first started the study concept, I think there were various intervals being bounced around and considered. I think there was interest in generating monthly reports at one point. I think as the analytical team, we were more leaning towards maybe every 6 months, just to kind of cut down on the resource intensity of the work. So I think quarterly was sort of what we settled on as being sort of the happy middle ground. And I think quarterly turned out to be quite feasible. I think monthly would have been stretching the capacity by quite a bit. And also, even though we were tracking individuals, it was still not a real-time study. So in the sense that there's still a data lag in terms of outcomes and endpoint ascertainment. So even if we were able to logistically produce the reports on a monthly basis, I don't think you'll see really tangible difference in the outcomes per se. So I think quarterly is probably makes the most pragmatic sense from my perspective anyway.
Yeah, maybe the only comment I would add to that is, by looking at these reports on a quarterly basis, we were able to, and then using the steering committee and having the expertise that was there, we were able to get an understanding of what data might be really, really important for us, right? What data would those clinicians want to see? What data might payers want to see? And we were able to work with Dr. Cheung and team and tweak these reports from one quarter to another and say, hey, you know what, maybe this category doesn't actually show us what's meaningful and relevant, and so could we tweak it? And so we were able to, using that quarterly frequency, we were able to actually tweak these reports to make them more useful.
Maybe just to give an example in terms of what we mean by tweaking, the endpoints didn't change per se, but one of the things that we looked at was reasons why someone stopped the medication. But then when we classify those categories, they change over time. So initially we had maybe 2 or 3 categories. We lumped some of them together to make it more clinically useful. So I think that steering committee feedback was very helpful to make the report useful and informative.
Okay, fantastic. And I'm curious about the frequency of the timing of the reports. Question for Jessica. What is your thought on quarterly versus monthly versus every 6 months? What does that feel like for a payer?
I think in my space, it would probably end up being our team that would have to generate the analysis, depending on how this theoretical activity would be structured in the future. So I think quarterly is ambitious. It probably really just depends on what's the nature of the agreement and how it's structured. Ideally, as Winson said, to get meaningful data, it would take even more than a quarter to determine whether or not the outcomes or the analysis that you have is meaningful to support any reconciliation with the manufacturer. So, and being that it's resource intensive, not knowing how many you would have of these to manage, it's just something that would have to be considered, whether the resources are there, the number of these that are in action, and what's going to be meaningful at what cadence.
Okay, fantastic. I'm going to pick this same concept up with Graham. I'm curious from your experience of managing the drug plan, would you want to see data at a quarterly or every 6-month frequency? Like, what would be appropriate for you as a payer with an LBA?
Well, I just take off a bit from Jessica's comments. In government, I don't know which law of thermodynamics it is, but every action leads to an equal and opposite reaction. So when you create a report, it has to be analyzed. People are already busy. I think twice a year is plenty, maybe even just annually. And if we're tracking things like overall survival and tying them to a price regime in a financial agreement, really it's going to be the back end that's the most important piece on that outcome. That being said, I think any kind of tool or reporting is helpful for the budget planning process and engagement of Treasury Board. That's very important because when you transfer dollars between fiscal years, that Treasury Board sometimes will punish you vigorously for that by actually saying, well, you obviously have surplus dollars, so we're going to start you out next fiscal year on a reduction basis, actually taking some money away, which is one of the reasons why often payers produce or prefer simple rebate kind of agreements. And I just guess how that would tie to this is any kind of OBA arrangement would likely be looking at kind of discount pricing and then agreement to increase price if outcomes are achieved at a later point, which ties back to probably less frequent reporting and more focusing on the outcomes on the back end would be something payers would be opting in for.
I just want to provide further context. I think this study was also designed in a very strategic way in the sense that we chose a tumor site that was relatively rare. So even despite that, the quarterly reporting was quite intensive. So if this OBA was now done in the real world involving a more common disease setting, I think that does alter the logistics of things, and it could make it quite tough to report on a quarterly or monthly basis. In this cohort specifically, there was like fewer than 100 patients. So I can imagine the workload increasing quite drastically in a different setting where things are a little more common and it's a more prevalent disease.
Okay.
And I think very much would depend on the therapy area itself too, right? So what's the therapy area? What's the most relevant outcome? What's the actual relevance of the frequency of that reporting? There may be certain areas where, depending on the outcome, you actually need that data report faster or sooner than the quarterly or even the biannual. And so I think this is very much dependent on the therapy area, and would have to be, I think this whole idea of early engagement, making sure we've got all the right people at the table to be able to say this is the right outcome, this is the right frequency, and this is how we'll do it, would be ideal in these situations, or would be needed, I think, were we to actually pursue an OBA.
Okay, fantastic. Let's get back to the ASCOT study for a second. So we saw in this study that 4 of the outcomes that they assessed, overall survival, time to next treatment, duration of treatment, and reason for discontinuation, were feasible in Alberta and could potentially be used to support an OBA. So I'm going to ask this question to Jessica. I'm curious if, based on your experiences, do you feel that in this case these are appropriate outcomes to look at for an OBA? Or even, what is your reaction to using these types of outcomes to support an innovative agreement?
I think it's drug indication specific. For us, we did an analysis on adjuvant therapy, and it took a significant amount of time to, obtain mature data in that space. So when we're looking at advanced disease, these are probably outcomes that are more meaningful and faster to obtain. So I just really think it depends on the indication.
Yeah. Okay. Do you have any comments on that? No? Anyone else? No? Okay, perfect. Maybe one more for Jessica, so picking on you a little bit. I'm curious, now that you've seen this study, the way the ASCOT was set up, would this be possible with Ontario data or the data that you work with?
Yes, yeah, short answer is yes. The data's there, so definitely we've looked at overall survival, time to next treatment. It's available.
Okay, perfect, thank you. Okay, maybe a little bit more of a high-level question for our panelists. Now, we've seen in recent years a number of mechanisms come into place to help sort of fast-track innovative drugs that are promising with limited evidence. We know on the regulatory side, there's Project Orbis here in Canada. We've seen Quebec's INS Promise of Value HTA pathway. We've seen the TLR and PTAP pathway, time limit recommendation from the CDAMC come out recently as well. But that initiative, for the moment anyways, excludes the use of real-world evidence as confirmatory data. So now we're looking at RWE and thinking about that. How could the learnings that we see here from the ASCOT study help contribute to evolving our thinking around the use of real-world evidence to support timely market access through formalized mechanisms, or maybe less formalized mechanisms like outcomes-based agreements? And maybe I'll start with Graham.
Yeah, sure. I guess first thing I'd just say is even with the time-limited recommendation, a logical next step is going to be that we do start including outcomes-based agreements and real-world evidence sort of in that trajectory. I know they're in the trial stage right now on that whole process. But I think this study shows that good data can be gathered and that can inform and should inform even those processes. In any case, something that's rocketing through the system, that's, notice from compliance with conditions and time-limited recommendations and being flagged for PTAP, you need something in the toolkit, like an OBA-style arrangement to actually help things and to come up with innovative listing regimes and pricing regimes. So I think it's very necessary, and this study shows that there's a lot of feasibility there. And I think you could just build into the OBA how, when the phase 3 trial data comes in, how that's going to be incorporated. I actually imagine a scenario where even if phase 3 trial was, hum-ha, but no safety signal, but things looked really good on the OBA side, I think you could still see continued funding and maybe an augmentation of that funding from a payer perspective. It's all just information inputs into decision-making. At the end of the day, payers don't want to pay for drugs that don't work. Patients don't want to be on drugs that don't work either. So I think there is some common sense approach that can come into all this.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Dr. Cheung, I'm curious, sort of a similar question for you, but maybe your experience from the data generation side. How do you feel about these types of data initiatives being done? And is that something that you see as possible to support timely access initiatives?
I mean, I'm probably, preaching to the converted, but I definitely, I've been doing this for many, many years now, and I definitely see the value in RWE, especially the ASCOT study. But I think that the devil's in the details in terms of how the study is operationalized. A common question that came up based on the ASCOT study is, well, can we now leverage the findings here to influence decision in other jurisdictions or other provinces? So I go back to the point I made during my talk, which is it would be, I think, important to maybe replicate the study either in a different setting in Alberta or in other provinces. I think the PSP data also brings a lot of promise because it is national in scope. And I do wonder whether if PSPs can be designed sort of preemptively or a priori with an OB in mind, can they be more enriched in a way where the data sets are hold more value and hold more strength, and by doing so can be leveraged more fully and more wholesomely for an OBA type setup.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm curious, for Jessica, whose desk this may land on one day, how do you feel about this type of data initiative and linking it to market access agreements?
Yeah, I guess I have to, throw it out there, as we always say, and we always hear, it can't be a mechanism to bypass the gold standard. There have to be criteria by which it's identified that this drug is truly meaningful, meets an unmet need, and is really going to bring value to the system, that there's just the anticipation of that. It can't be that RWE is the solution for quick patient access. We're really looking for products that are going to bring value to the system and have demonstrated clear, meaningful benefit. But RWE, obviously, there's no question there's value in that. We're looking at data that demonstrates that real patients in the real world are benefiting, and how can we say there's no value in using that? But then the tricky part comes in that whole risk share aspect of it. How do you bring those products forward, knowing that there's a true risk share associated with it, knowing that there are limited resources? So there's a lot there to balance, but I think clear criteria on what can pass as a really good OBA candidate is important to establish.
Okay, thank you. All right, this is my heads up to the audience that I'm going to ask them one more question, and then I'm going to be counting on all of you. I saw Dawn stretching. Good. Give it a minute, okay? Give it a minute. So I'd like all of us here to reflect a little bit about your experiences with ASCOT, and I'm curious, one, if you have any final comments you'd like to add before we go to audience questions, and two, is there any additional research you're either thinking about working on, or it's something that you think that it would be nice to see or work on to help advance our knowledge and capabilities in RWE generation to support timely access mechanisms? So maybe I'll throw it down to the end. Dr. Sayani, you can go first on this.
Yeah, I'll start with our experience on this study and working with Dr. Cheung and his group and the different investigators that we had involved in the steering committee. I mean, I think it was a very positive experience, right? For us, I think what was absolutely valuable was the ability to be able to show that we could use real-world data from a health system to be able to demonstrate real-world outcomes in this particular patient group. It was absolutely positive that the real-world overall survival tracked very much the RCT data, so that was positive for us. But generally, if I think about what did we get out of this, it was that we're able to do this, right? This is what we set out to do, and we were able to demonstrate that we can do it. I think where this now goes is I think we've kind of been talking about this towards the end here, is can we actually use real-world evidence in some of these mechanisms that are starting to come through the system, like TLR, and there may be others where we can in fact use real-world evidence to be able to improve access and timely access for drugs. So I do feel there's a real opportunity there. Granted, it's not for every potential drug and every potential indication, but it's something that should absolutely be on the table, I would say. The data in Canada is continuing to evolve. We always say we have a very good health data system. It may be fragmented, but there is very good data across the country. And so how do we continue to use these opportunities to strengthen our data infrastructure in the country? I think we've got to think about vehicles like HDRN as an example. There are other pan-Canadian initiatives, data initiatives as well, that we've got to think about and see if we can use those as vehicles as well. So I think the vehicles are there, the approach is possible. We've shown proof that this can be done, and I think we've got to do more. Certainly from our own perspective, there are things we could have done better. You know, we talked about the payer, we talked about the patient. One of the things that Dr. Cheung and I have spoken about is the idea of a rolling cohort as well. We had one cohort that we followed, and at the end of the year, we kind of ended the study. But we've talked about a rolling cohort as well, right? Being able to continue to bring patients into the cohort. And so there are other opportunities for us to continue to strengthen this work, and I think that's where we'd like to go next.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Rolling cohorts, I heard it. Graham, for you.
Yeah, I guess just in terms of summary comments, I would say, I mean, it's super encouraging to see this happening, to see that it can work. There hasn't been a ton of experience with OBA, but there has been a lot of experience, which I think offers example by analog through special authorization on special medicines, and similar learnings can be gathered there. And from our use of that program, I could tell you, overburdening the agreement with asking it to just do too much can really break things down and slow things down. Also, you really do need something like a scientific committee, somebody that makes the final court of truth decision on, is the outcome working? So I think there's some learnings there. And especially if price is going to be tied to outcomes, there's always going to be a desire to reduce interpretation on the back end. I guess the last thing I would say is, it should be in the admin data, but one of the things it'd be neat to track, certainly be of interest to the payer, is just the total health system costs while on serving that patient while they're on the drug. I think that'd be a lot of interest to the payer and could provide some insights into future work as well.
Okay, thank you for those comments. Jessica?
Yeah, I agree. I think this is a great demonstration of what the potential is for an OBA. I think taking it one step further is something of interest. We talked about this in the pre-meeting, is let's tie some numbers to it. Let's see the what if we had done it this way in an agreement, what would that have looked like, and would we have seen added value at the end for a structure like this? I think where the rubber meets the road is probably of interest as well. And as I mentioned earlier, I think a national concerted effort, a framework, criteria, a true interest in risk share, knowing that there's equal interests at stake in these sorts of agreements, and I don't know. I think that's it.
Thank you. Dr. Cheung, any final words for you?
I think I agree with what all the other panelists have said already. But in my view, I think the ASCOT study is really, it's just scratched the surface. I think during the study process, it became evident that there were a number of other outcomes that would be equally valuable. So things like patient-reported outcomes, quality of life, and as more cancer centers are now beginning to collect these variables on a routine basis, it'd be great in the future OBA to really incorporate these patient-centric endpoints, because they're obviously extremely important. So I think incorporating more endpoints would be very, 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 very important. Hopefully, can be done in the future.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for your comments and for your work on the ASCOT study and sharing all of that with us today. I'm going to open it up to the floor now. Don, the mic is yours.
Right on. Don Husro from Ottawa, policy researcher. Thanks, Winson, for sharing the study. It was great. I'm just curious, so the outcomes that this is a really curious question, and it's going to go to two people, but the outcomes that you highlighted are kind of population-based outcomes, aggregate, average, survival, time to discontinuation. It's possible that somebody's interested in some individual outcomes, like, for example, early failures or maybe even long-term success. Is the data that you have amenable to that kind of thing? I mean, just given how it's curated whenever, it's anonymized, obviously. Is it okay? You can identify individual cases. Is that something that's did that even come up in your steering committee discussions?
So it is possible, and as you know, there are certain data rules about suppressing really small cells. For this cohort, we did do chart audit, like chart review for some of the cases, and I may have gone through this too quickly, but we also did capture reasons for stopping therapy, and that's not available through admin sources. So we are able to do a chart review of patients. Again, this was a very manageable number of cases, but again, if the number goes up a lot higher, then I think it becomes less feasible to do. So the short answer is yes, we can look at that, but again, depends on what parameters we're delving into. And if it's really, really rare, then there's a risk of identifying the individuals, in which case we would have to mask those findings.
Yeah, that's how I wondered about the rare, and I wondered about some rare individuals within a bigger cohort, and so I saw you had a rare cancer. I'm just also, the follow-up question is, Jessica or Graham, I mean, do you think payers would be more interested in these individual cases like early failures, or do you think they'd be equally interested in, aggregate outcomes like average survival, average? Maybe you think it's just depends on the case, but just putting you on the spot, but what do you think?
I don't know. I guess it's always easy to say both, but I think probably more on the aggregate, particularly from a payer perspective, maybe even getting to disease-free survival rather than overall survival, which is a bit of a different angle on looking at the performance of the drug. That'd be my perspective. If you have one, Jessica.
No, I agree. I think maybe in cases of rare disease and higher cost drug product, that may become more of interest, but I think at this point, aggregate is sufficient.
Yeah, maybe just to add to a comment on that, Don, I think one of the key reasons we set this up in this way, as an industry sponsor, obviously we didn't want to have any patient-level data. And so we set it up so that we were only getting that aggregate data. I think were this to be a real OBA for certain conditions, like maybe rare diseases or something of that sort, where the payer was directly involved in the adjudication, there may be potential to be able to share exactly how an individual patient is doing. But I think that would be very much dependent on that particular case and what that therapy area was.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks for the question. And Lester, hi.
Thanks a lot. This is a great conversation. So thanks a lot for the publication and study. I guess this question is more for Jessica and Graham. So I don't know if Winson and Amyn did a good enough sales job to convince you now we got to do OBAs or Allison, right? Seems like it's a lot of effort, a lot of work, a lot of resources. So I think, Graham, you mentioned something that I think was fantastic. You said, sometimes we got to make sure that if we do an OBA, it can't do too much, right? It has to have a very specific objective. So what do you think is the primary objective that would tip you, like payers, to actually conduct an OBA for a drug or test or whatever it could be, right? Is it, for example, would it be primarily trying to reduce costs would be like the major objective? And then second part to the question would be like, what would be an example of like a disease or some characteristics of a disease that would fit into something that would tip you over to actually do an OBA? Thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I'm gonna try and go quickly. I would say in terms of the things that are gonna flag for eligible for OBA, things that have variable response, limited data, or disputed therapeutic benefit. Those kinds of things are an initial filter. Another indicator is what's coming through on a time-limited recommendation. Now, that means initially we might see a lot of stuff being just on the oncology side, but I guess what I'd just say in terms of coming back to the remarks you were referencing earlier, just keep it simple. Like what it comes down to is we really have to just do some of these. Like we just have to do them. And so that's why it's so exciting to see this study come through. It shows that it can be done. We can keep it simple, and we can track that data, and it should inform payer decision making on that. So I don't know, Jessica, if you have to.
Sure. I think the financial component is important, and that's a driver for OBA, but also knowing that patients are in fact benefiting from the intervention. Just funding blanket cases and not knowing for certain that we're getting the benefit we expected, that's a real gap, I think. And when working with limited resources going forward, it's a combination of financial, but also wanting to know that we're putting resources towards the most valuable outcomes. And cases of rare disease are probably the ones that are the best candidates. However, you're also dealing with small populations, so that brings its own challenges. Yeah, great question.
I'm going to just jump in here because there's one thing I heard that I want to remind everyone. OBAs are not a tool for negotiation to get a lower price. OBAs are a tool for timely market access. So remember the toolbox analogy at the beginning. It's when there's not timely market access. Use a PLA if you can, please, okay? And if you can't get there, and if there's going to be timely market access, that's the appropriate time for outcomes-based agreements. It's not a negotiation tool for price lowering. It's about timely access. Jerry and then Trish.
Thanks. Actually, I have two questions, so should I ask them both, or do I get
Jerry,
one?
Trish, Jerry. Or Trish.
Just with regard to the comments earlier about cross-jurisdictional data and stuff. I wonder, and I'm asking this of Graham and Jessica, would a study that was conducted using Alberta data be acceptable as as evidence for another province? And can we avoid having to do these nationally by simply realizing that there's not going to be a lot of difference between a patient in Nova Scotia and a patient in Alberta?
Absolutely. I think any opportunity, and I speak for myself, any opportunity to use resources mindfully is a great, is a direction that's probably worth exploring. I'll leave it at that. I think there's definitely generalizability across Canada, so I don't think that there's harm in using another province's data as proxy or analysis as proxy. But I think that there's strength in numbers, so if there are other provinces that can engage in a particular agreement and provide that data, that's always even more meaningful.
Graham?
Yeah, maybe I'll just even augment that. I could say for certain that at the pCPA we did have some of these discussions about how to our comfort level with using proxy data and results from another jurisdiction. And I think where we kind of got to eventually in that conversation is yes, cautiously optimistic to your question, that can happen, but people always want to pressure test the, at the front end in terms of, okay, how rigorous is your system, what's actually being gathered, who's involved, et cetera, and I think if you can get that right at the front end, there can be a comfort level with using data on proxy.
Okay, Trish, it's your mic.
So, and I'll just add to that, we would definitely use other provinces' data, assuming that there wasn't a difference in the care. So for example, if Alberta or something also covered some sort of adjuvant therapy that other provinces didn't cover, in that case, you can't, it's apples and apples. Now I forgot my question.
Well, you did a good job of answering that
Thanks
question.
for answering that.
I have to make up for you guys. Just kidding.
Yeah, someone's got to, yeah.
Hey.
Okay, so this is fantastic. I can't wait to read the details of this. Having been in the space for a while, things fall apart very, very quickly when it comes to assigning the thresholds. So at what threshold of overall survival of any of the performance measures does either the OBA end or coverage discontinue? And I'm just wondering if there are any plans to continue this, this analysis in that regard. So were there any thresholds discussed as to when the OBA, the agreement would terminate and coverage would cease?
I'll take an initial stab at it, and then Dr. Cheung may want to as well. So in this particular situation, because this was what we called a mock OBA, we did not have any sort of financial component linked to the outcomes. Having said that, just generally what we were looking for is how well would these outcomes track to the clinical trial. And I think that's what we would normally be looking for, I think, in these sorts of agreements, is how close are we to what we might be seeing in the trial. So we didn't talk about anything of that sort in terms of thresholds. Would we want to do something, continue to do this and think about those thresholds? I think there would certainly be appetite, because I think this is where the next step for us could be, is if we were to bring a payer on board, is to say, okay, how should we think about, even if it is a mock financial agreement, right? What should that look like? What should thresholds be? And have some further conversations around that. I think that's certainly a really valuable next step for us to consider.
One other thing I want to add to that is that I think setting thresholds, it's quite tricky in the real world, because I think in this study, I think the outcomes tracked quite well with the original trial. But having done similar studies in other disease settings, because rural patients are sometimes sicker and frailer than the trial population, it's probably unrealistic to expect the outcomes to always align with the trial. So how close is good enough would be a very pivotal question, and how do we determine that is also quite challenging. So really good point, but in terms of how to operationalize and implement it, I think is yet to be determined, I think.
Thanks for that question. Jerry, there's actually a question behind you. I think I'm going to give priority, and then you're going to get the last question.
Sorry. My name's Joan Paulin, and I'm a patient advocate for a rare disease organization. And my first part is a comment and then a question. And the comment is that I agree and I support completely patient organization inclusion much earlier in the process for a couple of reasons. The earlier that we are included in the process, the easier it is to get buy-in, because we actually, when you're asked to be part of the process, you actually understand the process better. The other thing I support, I think patient organizations would support, is the addition of patient-reported outcomes, burden of illness, those kinds of things that are important to patients. My question is, we talk about getting patients earlier in the process. Because this is the confusing part for me, is I would assume that if you're going to be doing a outcomes-based agreement, that would be a decision that's made very early in the process, because you understand what the drug is and there's an assessment, especially in the rare disease space, that you're going to be running into things about a lack of evidence, a small patient population, a possibility that the drug is meeting an unmet need. So my assumption is that an outcomes-based agreement, and the drug is going to be expensive. So my assumption is that an outcomes-based agreement would actually be something that would be talked about very early in the process, and again, something that I think that patients need to be involved in. We don't need to be involved in the pricing, we just need to be involved in understanding, so that getting back to Tricia's point about thresholds, if we are part of understanding what the thresholds are, then you're also going to get better buy-in from the patient organizations. So yeah, the question is, where do outcomes-based agreements fall in terms of, or the decision to be using an outcomes-based agreement, where does that fall in the process? Thank you.
Yeah, I think as soon as possible in the process, and like we had mentioned earlier, even in a pre-submission meeting, HTA, involvement of the patient community, involvement of patients, absolutely. And frankly, I think even all through and on the back end, we should be getting to a higher level of transparency on the nature of the agreement, what's being tracked, and publication of the results. Not the pricing scheme, obviously, but, and you've already acknowledged that, but I think everything else should be, so that we can have a continuous improvement approach to this.
I think if we go with a framework where the sponsor is submitting a proposal at the HTA stage to identify that their product is a good candidate for an OBA, it's right there at that point. HTA is already engaging with patients, getting patient input. Patients are consolidating survey data, providing that to the CDA, INES. Those are opportunities to further engage the patient on those topics.
Okay, thank you guys so much. Jerry, I just got the end sign from the team, but I invite you to come talk with the group after. So thank you so much to all of the panelists here today, and for you in the audience for being so engaging and asking great questions. Coffee time.